my older brother drove me to depression. This story began long before I was born, but its impact continues to be felt to this day. This is an account of my attempts to deal with the past in order to gain control of my life. My name is Katrina, I am 35 years old, and I live in a small town in the state of Texas. I have an older brother, Brandon, who as an only child developed selfish habits. With the birth of me, he became violent and moody. His aggression and manipulation left problems in my psyche, and my mom's support only made things worse. Brandon, my older brother, is 7 years older than me. In his early childhood, he was the center of the universe for our parents, the only child that everyone loved and cared for. Because all the attention was focused on him, he grew up with a sense of privilege, which led to him being spoiled and capricious. When I was born, everyone in our family rejoiced at the event except Brandon. He saw me as a threat to his place in his parents' heart and did everything he could to show his displeasure. His tantrums weren't just whimsical, he threatened my parents to leave home if I wasn't put away. In my younger years, my brother became a real tyrant to me. At first it all seemed like normal childish pranks, but as time went on, his antics became more and more cruel. He knew that I feared him more than anything else in the world, and he used that weakness to his advantage. His manipulations were masterful. He would force me to obey his wishes by threatening to tell my parents about my bad behavior if I disobeyed him. This created a circle of fear and control from which it was difficult for me to escape. I remembered one time, trying to get away from him, I hid in a closet, hoping he would lose interest in me. But he found me, and his anger was renewed. He made me clean his room, and when I refused, he grabbed my arm and started pulling me down the stairs, threatening to throw me down. The feeling I had at that moment was nothing short of the realization that he could really hurt me. My fear reached a breaking point. I cried and begged him to stop, but he just laughed, knowing it amused him. Thankfully, at that moment, my mom came in and intervened. However, even after her intervention, the situation didn't improve. She continued to defend Brandon, convincing me that he was just a kid and that it would all pass with time. This attitude only added to my misery and put pressure on me, leaving me feeling defenseless. As we grew older, brother Brandon became a secretive manipulator. He continued to control me while I was in college, but I learned to resist his manipulations. As I got older, Brandon stopped being overtly hostile, but that didn't mean he changed. On the contrary, he became more insidious and cunning. I realized that despite his outward charm and his efforts to look like a caring brother, he was still hiding his true intentions behind that mask. He made scenes where he showed his support, but I knew it was just an illusion designed to mask his true nature. When I got to college, his behavior became even more aggressive, though unnoticeable. He started following me, calls, texts, attempts to control every fact of my life. He was interested in who I was socializing with, who I was dating, what places I was going to and what I was doing. His attempts to impose his control escalated, and I realized that he thought he could manipulate me like he did when I was a child. Every time I met a guy, Brandon would actively interfere in my life. He would send threats to the young men I was socializing with, effectively forcing them to break off any relationship with me. These guys would suddenly stop communicating, not even giving me a chance to get an explanation or put a stop to what was just beginning. His constant manipulation wasn't just limited to relationships, it extended to my friends as well. Brandon would skillfully fake messages on my behalf, sending them negative or offensive comments. My friends took it seriously when they received such messages, and despite my attempts to explain that I would never write anything like that, they refused to believe me. Even when I tried to convey to them that it wasn't me and that he was using me as a puppet, their disbelief only increased my feelings of isolation. This constant manipulation affected my relationships, leaving me all alone, and I didn't know who to turn to for support. But I became stronger and less vulnerable. I fought his attempts to suppress me, although the fear that had been there since childhood didn't go away completely. I stopped being afraid of him, but the memories of him ruining my life still pressed in on me, leaving me in a strange state of anxiety. I often felt exhausted, broken, and drained emotionally, yet I tried to hide it from others, not wanting to burden anyone with my problems. I longed to be free of this control, but there was still a fear inside that it would once again manifest its destructive nature. When I moved to another city, I thought I could start my life over, away from my brother. However, Brandon didn't leave me alone. He continued to stalk me, using every means to make sure I didn't forget about him. By creating a fake social media account, he found a way to follow my every move. I was horrified at the realization that he could watch my life even from a distance. The thought turned my daily life into a nightmare. I began to withdraw into myself, and every time I went outside, I felt anxious and afraid. Simple interactions with people became a challenge because I was afraid that he might know my every move. I froze at the slightest rustle or call, as thoughts swirled in my head that Brandon could track me at any moment. All I wanted was to get rid of his presence and start living freely. But my hopes for a new life proved too optimistic. Brandon was cunning and resourceful, always finding new ways to control and manipulate me. Not only did he monitor my social media accounts, reading my correspondence and leaving me threats, but he also tried to find out who I was socializing with and what I was planning to do. This constant sense of surveillance made me paranoid. I felt like I was under a microscope all the time, afraid that he would find out about my plans and try to interfere, ruining even the simplest moments of happiness. Every meeting with friends, every attempt to enjoy my new life exacerbated this paranoia. I felt like I couldn't even fully trust my loved ones anymore, doubting that Brandon couldn't manipulate them as well. This constant stress and fear began to hamper my ability to enjoy life, and I found myself sinking further and further into isolation, seeking a safe haven from his dark influence. When I finally found a job, I hoped it would be the beginning of a new life. However, Brandon once again intruded into my life as if he had no other occupation. He quickly found out how I was living my life and began actively working to destroy everything I was trying to build. At first, this manifested itself in his attempts to undermine my reputation. He went to extreme measures, spreading rumors that I was incompetent and lazy. I was shocked at how relentless he was, and it made it difficult for me to work, as I had to fight for every opportunity to be heard and recognized in the team. Difficult and strained relationships with coworkers caused me to be in a constant state of stress. I tried to prove my worth, but the effort was not paying off and soon I had no energy left. Brandon used his connections and influence to eventually get me to quit. I felt utterly broken, as if my entire life had already been predetermined by his ruthless control. After quitting, I fell into a deep depression and my hopes for a better future dissipated. I lost faith in myself and the people around me. Days turned into a gray mass as I shut myself away at home, spending hours in bed. I cried in silence, pondering how I could have ended up in such a state. Every time I tried to lift my head, I was overwhelmed by hopelessness, and I couldn't imagine how to get out of the hole my brother had created. But at one point I realized that sinking further into depression would not solve my problems and would only strengthen his control over me. I began to realize that the only way out of this situation was to change it myself. I decided that I could no longer let my brother control my life. This was my first step to recovery. I needed to take control of my situation, to find ways to reclaim my dreams and hopes that Brandon had tried to destroy. I knew it would be a difficult path, but if I didn't take action, I would forever be in his shadow. With that thought, I set in motion a process of change that I hoped would lead me to freedom. I decided it was time to put an end to this nightmare. I enrolled in psychology classes to get to the bottom of why I was allowing Brandon to affect my life. I studied family trauma and the mechanisms people use to manage their pain. I discovered new vistas of understanding and strength. I knew the first thing to do was to address the issue with my mom. She always defended Brandon, even when he was wrong. I talked to her and she admitted that she was wrong. She apologized and promised to support me in whatever decision I made. After that, I went to a counselor to develop a plan of action. I wanted Brandon to feel the gravity of his actions. The psychologist suggested a strategy that included therapy and rehabilitation. I accepted it, knowing it was the best way to regain control of my life. I finally realized that it was time to put an end to this nightmare that had gone on for too long. This was a defining moment for me. I could no longer tolerate a will-less existence under Brandon's control. At that moment, I received a call from my former coworker Leah. She, always cheerful and energetic, suggested we meet, and although I was initially hesitant, I agreed, feeling that it would be helpful to talk to someone who could listen to me. When we met in a cozy cafe, where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, Leia was genuinely sympathetic to my dismissal and continued to talk about my troubles. I realized I could trust her with my secrets, so I ventured to tell her about the horrors I was facing because of Brandon. I detailed how he manipulates not only me, but those around me as well. As we talked, I hatched a plan, a crazy, possibly risky plan, to free myself from his control. I told Leah about my brother and his violent influence on my life, and she listened with full attention. Inspired by her support, I offered to help her help me. I asked Leah to come to Brandon's girlfriend's house and inform her that she was pregnant by him. This, I hoped, would deeply shock him and break his control over me. Leah agreed, not without realizing the risk, and soon I saw the change take place. Leah actually went to Brandon's girlfriend and informed her of her pregnancy. This caused quite a storm of emotions. The conversation ended in a major uproar, and the girl, unable to stand it, walked away from him. I could not hold back a smile when I learned about what had happened. Immediately after that, rumors started spreading in our circle and then on social media, like a fire wave covering everything around. Every conversation, every mention of Brandon turned into a discussion about his scandalous behavior, and soon he was in the spotlight. In his company, where he worked, this news caused a real shock. Colleagues began to judge him and discuss him behind his back. This was a real blow to him, and he began to have conflicts with the team. Brandon, who had always strived for an impeccable reputation and status, found himself in a situation where his personal life became the subject of judgment and ridicule. His reputation, which he held so dear, was starting to come apart at the seams. I could only imagine his confused face when he realized he was losing control not only of his reality, but also of how he was perceived by others. His eyes must have reflected so much rage and despair when he realized that his manipulations and threats were no longer working and his power over me and over others was fading. The plan I had created was indeed working, and in that moment I felt a surge of strength and hope, as if I had finally broken free of the heavy shackles that had once bound me. It was something incredible to see his world crumble, and to realize that maybe I was finally able to take control of my own destiny. I began to feel all the fear and anxiety that had been plaguing me gradually disappear, and a new desire to fight for happiness and myself was born from within. I realized that the real fight was just beginning, but now I wasn't alone. I had Leah's support and my own determination to get through this horror that had haunted me for so long. Each new day brought with it a wave of liberation and confidence that I was taking an active part in my own destiny. Despite all the risks and possible consequences, I knew I was finally moving toward my freedom, and that gave me the strength to keep fighting. One of the turning points came when I decided to return to my hometown to talk to Brandon in person. I knew it was a risky move, but I needed to finish what I had started. I drove to our old childhood home and there our conversation took place. At first, he refused to admit his guilt. He tried to justify himself by saying that his actions were caused by family problems. But I didn't let him get away with it. I reminded him of every time he had hurt me and how it had affected my life. He began to sob, and I realized that he had finally realized the seriousness of his actions. After the conversation, I went home to my town knowing that I had taken the first step to recovery. I felt like I could breathe a little easier. Brandon promised to go to rehab, and I knew it was a step in the right direction. A year after starting the program, Brandon completed rehab. He went through a lot of struggles, but eventually admitted his guilt and started working on himself. I was glad that he was able to overcome his barriers and take charge of his health. I saw him change, becoming a more responsible and understanding person. We continued to communicate, but our relationship was far from the same. He didn't try to interfere in my life, and I felt I was free from his influence. We reached a compromise, and I no longer felt intimidated by him. He promised to support me in every endeavor, and I trusted that he would keep his word.